Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to systematically dismantle one of the most pervasive, deep-seated myths about Indian agriculture. We're going to look right past the paper rights, past the cultural assumptions, and examine a profound structural shift that has quietly but completely transformed the very foundation of our food systems.
I want you to take just a second to really think about this question. When you picture a farmer working out in the fields, who do you see? If you're like most of us, your mind immediately conjures up a specific default image. A man, maybe driving a tractor, or standing proudly amidst his crops. I mean, it's the image on our currency notes, it's in our school textbooks, and it's all over the media. But the actual data? It tells a radically different story.
Okay, let's dive into this. The default assumption across the board is that farming is an overwhelmingly male occupation. But the periodic labor force survey from 2023 to 2024 reveals a stark reality on the ground. Over 80% of self-employed rural women are engaged in agriculture. The face of the Indian farmer is decidedly, undeniably female. And yet, our institutions, our policies, and quite frankly, our society operate as if she doesn't even exist.
Here is our agenda for this explainer. We'll cover the agrarian crisis and male exit, structural immobility, the institutional friction, the political economy of inaction, and finally, pathways to reform.
Let's start with Section 1, the agrarian crisis and male exit, focusing on the macro-level push factors. To understand women in agriculture, we first really need to understand why the men are leaving.
Let the absolute gravity of the single data point sink in for a moment. Over 85% of smallholder farms in India are currently economically unviable. Simply put, because of persistently low returns, staggering input cost inflation, and these inescapable cycles of debt, farming for the vast majority of smallholders just can't sustain a household anymore. This harsh economic reality acts as the primary push factor, triggering a massive outmigration of men who are desperately seeking off-farm wage labor.
And if we look historically, this land fragmentation is stark. Back in 1971, the average farm size was about 2.28 hectares. By 2015, that had more than halved to just 1.08 hectares. As land gets chopped up across generations, the plots become way too small to survive on. And compounding this, between 2014 and 2024, nearly 1.73 lakh hectares of forest land were diverted. This effectively pushes agricultural labor, which is predominantly female, onto these marginal, degraded, low-yielding plots. So the land is shrinking and its quality is steadily declining.
Which brings us to Section 2, structural immobility. Let's look at why this burden falls so heavily on women.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that for women, immobility isn't a choice, it's a systemic trap. Women are physically anchored to the village by a relentless unpaid care burden, fetching water, collecting fuelwood, and raising children. So migration is structurally impossible for them. And even if it were possible, the patriarchal dynamics of joint families mean migration decisions are made entirely without their consent. Add to that the systemic safety risks and harassment in non-farm spaces that culturally confine women to the village. Plus, the poor wages in urban, domestic, or construction work make leaving economically irrational anyway. They are quite literally locked into the agrarian landscape.
And this immobility was profoundly exacerbated by macro policies, specifically the Green Revolution. It created this glaring mechanization asymmetry. Think about it. Male-dominated tasks, like plowing and threshing, were rapidly mechanized. This displaced male labor and freed them up to migrate. But conversely, the female-dominated tasks, transplanting paddy, weeding, seed sorting, were left entirely unmechanized. In fact, the demand for this intense, backbreaking physical labor was scaled up massively to support monoculture crops. It perfectly locked in a trapped female workforce.
Moving on to Section 3, the institutional friction, or what happens when you cultivate without recognition. Here we run into a severe ownership deficit. As we established, women constitute upwards of 75% of the agricultural workforce. Yet, as you can see, they hold merely 12% of the agricultural land. And let's be clear, even when they do hold a title, it's frequently the most fragmented, least fertile land available. The woman works the soil, but she simply does not own it.
And this brilliantly, or rather tragically, illustrates how lacking a simple paper title triggers total financial ruin. We call it the institutional domino effect. Step 1. Without a land title, the woman is legally invisible to the state. Step 2. This invisibility causes immediate institutional exclusion. She can't access formal credit, input subsidies, or crop insurance.
Step 3. Excluded from formal banking, she's forced into dependence on informal moneylenders charging predatory interest rates, which inevitably culminates in Step 4, an inescapable debt trap. The state only sees the landowner, completely ignoring the actual cultivator.
Operating in this invisible space generates some incredibly severe, undocumented vulnerabilities. Women are carrying a triple burden. They manage full farm operations, they execute over 5 hours of daily unpaid domestic labor, and they fulfill community obligations. The occupational health impacts are staggering. They suffer severe musculoskeletal and reproductive damage from relentless, unmechanized physical labor. They're out there administering toxic pesticides without protective equipment or any health insurance. And with men migrating for months at a time, or even permanently, they operate as de facto single mothers, bearing this immense, unmeasured psychological stress, and practically none of this is captured in our national health data.
Furthermore, their actual economic contribution is statistically erased. Things like subsistence farming, indigenous seed saving, and post-harvest processing, tasks predominantly managed by women, are systematically excluded from GDP calculations. In the eyes of our macroeconomic data, this vital, backbreaking work simply does not happen. Because they aren't counted, they aren't compensated. It's a systemic feature, not an accident.
Section 4. The political economy of inaction. Let's examine why decades of documentation continuously fail to bring about real change.
So, why has the system ignored this for 30 years? Analytically speaking, the disenfranchisement of female farmers economically benefits nearly every other layer of the agricultural ecosystem. Landowners benefit immensely from the wage suppression of an immobile, highly unorganized female labor force. Agricultural input companies benefit from the convenience of just maintaining their established, male-dominated purchasing and extension networks. Even the state benefits. Keeping female labor cheap acts as a massive, unacknowledged subsidy that maintains domestic food price stability and keeps our exports competitive. Put simply, inaction is highly profitable.
Over time, this dynamic creates a fascinating cultural phenomenon known in academia as masculinity recoding. As women increasingly take over the physical labor, farming becomes culturally recoded as low-status, feminized work. What this means is that young men, even in relatively profitable agrarian states, begin to flat-out refuse agricultural work, completely independent of the economic incentives. The social stigma compounds the exit, making the feminization of agriculture a totally self-reinforcing cycle.
Finally, Section 5, Pathways to Reform. How do we move from this illusion to structural reality?
So, the crucial point is what can actually be done. The most critical step is enacting an activity-based definition of a farmer. We need to recognize the person actually performing the labor, not just the one holding the deed. Practically speaking, we need mandated creches at MGNREGA work sites, and we need to synchronize Angawati schedules with agricultural training. Financially, institutions like NABARD absolutely must create direct credit windows tailored specifically for women, effectively bypassing those land collateral requirements entirely. And ecologically, rebalancing the minimum support price toward coarse grains would naturally restore more equitable mixed cropping systems.
However, any rigorous academic analysis requires us to also acknowledge the honest residual gaps, the things that no current policy framework even touches. The increasing agricultural burden on mothers routinely forces girl children to be pulled from school just to substitute for domestic labor. That's an intergenerational trap completely invisible in our data. Furthermore, left-behind women face relentless property disputes and land encroachment without any proper institutional redress mechanism. And finally, uniform central schemes consistently fail because they totally ignore the massive structural differences between the mobility constraints in northern states versus the market access issues in the South.
The feminization of Indian agriculture is not some distant future projection. It is our current, established reality. We have built an entire national food security apparatus on the unacknowledged, uncompensated, and unprotected labor of rural women, which leaves us with one final, profound question to consider today. If women feed the nation, why does our system refuse to see them?